For too long, Conservatives have allowed taxpayer-funded public institutions to indoctrinate the next generation with anti-Western, anti-British, anti-American ideas and ideologies.
I couldn't agree more. If universities are in receipt of taxpayer funding, then there are certain obligations that those institutions have to the public square.
I genuinely believe we are losing our country and we are losing the things that define the greater civilization we have created. Blair led a political revolution in this country, and a counter-revolution has to begin with rejecting much of what those governments actually brought about.
Today I'm joined by Matt Goodwin. Matt is Senior Research Fellow at the University of Buckingham and Honorary Professor at the University of Kent. We're going to be talking about the three corners of Britain's institutional landscape that Matt's been at the forefront of disrupting. First off, we'll be talking about Matt's diagnosis and prescriptions for Britain's universities and the culture of conformity which he believes them to be in the grip of. We'll be looking at the new media, and in particular Matt's role as author of one of the most widely read politics substacks in the world. And finally, we're going to turn to party politics and examine Matt's claim that what Britain needs now is nothing less than a political revolution. Welcome to First Light. Matt Goodwin, great to be with you.
Well, thank you for having me.
There's lots of things to talk about, but when I think of all the work that you've done in the last few years, I think of three main areas that you've been really at the forefront of disrupting: higher ed, universities, journalism, and of course, party politics. But let's start with higher ed. Tell us a little bit about the subject of your recent book, Bad Education, Fantastic Diagnosis, and of what's gone wrong in the universities and a prescription for how we can put things right.
Well, essentially, this book is about what happened over the course of 20 years of teaching and working in UK universities through the universities of Bath, Manchester, Nottingham, Kent, and really is an explanation as to why I fell out of love with higher education and my vocation. And essentially, it is about some of the things we know. The politicization of higher education. We know universities have moved sharply to the left. We know they've lost sight of their original founding objectives: truth, neutrality, evidence, free speech, good faith debate. But it's also more specifically about some of the things I encountered as I went through the stages of my academic career that really brought that crisis home to me. So it's an individual story, essentially, but it's telling you about the crisis within our universities from my perspective, what it was like to see very close friends of mine be sacked, harassed, and chased off campus simply because they held conservative or gender-critical views. And it's about what I saw as this DEI religion, which is what it is. It's a religion for the elite class, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as that was imposed down on these institutions, and what I encountered as an academic as I navigated those things. And as I say in the book, I think basically our universities, much like in North America, and they've had this debate, I think they're ahead of us in this debate, where we can see them reforming higher education under Trump too. But I think essentially my message here is UK universities have fundamentally lost their way. What we need to do is force them to return to the original mission of higher education, and I lay out a manifesto for doing that.
And you and I were part of an attempt that I think was, in the end, a successful attempt to force the last government, the Tory government in the last few years really from 2019 onwards. It was a clear manifesto commitment that the Tories came out with in December 2019, that they would sort out the universities and they would pass what became the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. Tell us a little bit about your experience from that. That strikes me as an example of positive change, kind of intervention of a right-wing government intervening in troubled sector to try and introduce some antidotes to the ideological capture and conformity. It's a sort of good case study of how really good, well-organized, elite group of institutional leaders could work with politicians to bring about serious change. Do you think, does that give you hope for the universities, for the sector?
So I think the Higher Education Free Speech Act in the UK, as far as I'm aware, is basically one of the only laws in the Western world that is forcing universities to promote and protect free speech on campus. Now, I didn't used to believe that the state should intervene in institutions to do that kind of thing. But for me, the radicalizing moments, if you like, because a lot of people out there say, Matt, what the hell happened to you? You know, you became this radical. And you used to be kind of moderate, status quo kind of guy. And my answer is always the same. It's not what happened to me, it's what happened to the people around me, because I watched the elite class, particularly in the universities, basically go off a cliff during the 2010s, the so-called Great Awakening, as the Americans would call it. Or as Andrew Sullivan once said, we're living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. And I think he's absolutely spot on. And for me, a couple of those moments, really powerful moments, one was going through Brexit and the referendum. I wasn't particularly a passionate Brexiteer before the referendum. I didn't really campaign publicly for Brexit. But when it happened, I was completely comfortable with it. And I was like, okay, the people want to leave the European Union. I understood why. I didn't think it was democratic. I was concerned about the erosion of sovereignty. And I said so publicly. The reaction to that from academic colleagues was a real eye-opener. And the second thing was the treatment of Kathleen Stock at the University of Sussex, who essentially, as a gender-critical scholar, was chased off campus because of her views. Nothing else. She just challenged the orthodoxy on campus. And then thirdly, a good friend of mine, Eric Kaufman, who was at Birkbeck and was similarly harassed because he was critical of mass immigration. And as I went through those moments, I sort of started to look up and put my head above the parapet and look around, and was just really coming to this question of where the hell am I working and what is the matter with these people? And it was at that time I was also in charge of the public speaker program at my university. And in the aftermath of Brexit, I decided, well, it's probably a good idea that our university students be exposed to some of the ideas and opinions and beliefs that led 52% of our fellow citizens to vote to leave the European Union. So I decided to invite somebody onto campus who I think had a pretty good understanding of that, David Goodhart, very prominent British thinker, writer, founder of Prospect magazine, very intelligent, articulate friend. And in the aftermath of inviting David onto campus, a special school meeting was convened for 30 members of staff to come together and discuss why a conservative, and I don't even think David would describe himself as a conservative, but why had he been allowed onto campus without a liberal discussant to challenge his views? And I thought, well, this is all very strange, because I've sat in universities for 15 years watching liberals debate liberals without any conservative discussant. And it brought home the nature of this crisis, which is how I ended up campaigning with yourself and alongside others and designing and developing the Higher Education Free Speech Act, because I simply came to the view that universities cannot be trusted to reform themselves. And when we finally got that law through, despite the Labour government doing everything it could to try and dilute it and overturn it, for me, the end destination of that was watching the University of Sussex, who had treated Kathleen Stock so poorly, be fined nearly £600,000 for failing to uphold free speech and free expression on campus, and knowing that every university on these islands will look at that, and will change their internal guidance and policies as a result of that. That is real change. I mean, that is disrupting the status quo that was failing our students, not just academics, but was failing our students, who are continuously told that diversity is the most important thing, except diversity of thought. And that is where the universities went wrong.
Yeah, and that suggests, the fine that was levied against the University of Sussex, and as you say, the kind of downstream deterrence effects that we think this is going to have on the higher ed sector, suggests that within that debate, and I remember that debate very well 4 or 5 years ago, should we or should we not push for a bit of legislation that is really going to, unsettle a lot of conservative instincts, which is, keep the government out of our big institutions, let the universities run themselves. It does suggest that those who said no, we've got to start using government for, to put things right, were in the right. And I think this is a sort of feature of the new right, you might say, on both sides of the Atlantic, that there's a sort of dawning realization that if you don't use power when you've got it for good ends, for the ends, which would justify taxpayer subsidy and so on, then we're going to lose every time, and things are just going to get worse and worse. So I think it's encouraging. I should say, in defense of my own institution, the University of Cambridge, the university here went through a lot of work preparing an act, a HEFSA-compliant free speech code, and pushed it through even at a time when it looked as if Labour was indeed going to torpedo the act. So there was a deterrence effect even before the Sussex judgment. But I think you're absolutely right. It is going to have some very, very, very positive effects.
And just briefly, I mean, you're absolutely right to say this isn't actually just about what's going on in the UK. What the reforms to the universities are really about is a much deeper philosophical split, I think, within the right, in that there are some of us who recognise that for too long, Conservatives have allowed taxpayer-funded public institutions to essentially indoctrinate the next generation with anti-Western, anti-British, anti-American, anti-science ideas and ideologies that have been weakening our civilization and societies from within. And this isn't now just about the universities. This is also, I think, now opening up fronts of activity, schools, charities, galleries, museums, legacy media, which we'll come on to talk about, where I think actually a new generation of Conservatives understand the need to intervene in institutions in order to safeguard the Conservative project more generally. And that is a fundamental difference from the pre-2010 era.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a question about really trying to shore up the fraying social contract between government and government. And if universities are in receipt of taxpayer funding, then there are certain obligations that those institutions have to the public square. One of them must be to model good civil disagreement on contentious issues that reasonable Brits disagree about. And one of the things, as you were talking, that came to mind was just, we've been here before. I think back to the 18th century. Oxford and Cambridge, pretty much the only universities in England, because of the Test Acts, were not allowed to admit Catholics, were not allowed to admit anyone who wasn't willing to sign up to effectively Anglicanism. And that created a sort of intellectual and institutional stagnation in Oxford and Cambridge. So the real intellectual energy in the 18th century was not in England, it was in Scotland. It was the Scottish Enlightenment, because there was a sense of, there wasn't that same kind of suffocating conformity. And I think what we're seeing now with the sort of, the kind of the new pressure valves are opening up. And one of them is this new centre which our mutual friend, Professor Eric Kaufman, has set up at the University of Buckingham, the Centre for Heterodox Social Science. And what hope and confidence do you have that alternate institutions will start to emerge, much as was the case in the 19th century with the big universities in London opening up in response to the sort of stultifying effects of the Test Acts on Oxford and Cambridge?
So I think what we're living through currently with the rise of alternative institutions, new universities, new media, new platforms is bigger than we currently understand, in the sense that we have a new generation of writers and thinkers who are fully insulated from the legacy institutions, which is a really, really important thing, because this hasn't really happened in the modern era until this point. So what I mean by that, new universities that students can engage with, academics can truly say what they want without fearing the consequences, new media, new podcasts, new YouTube channels, new Substacks, whatever, all of it is basically creating an ecosystem, which personally I find to be much more intellectually interesting than anything I encountered in the universities, where the groupthink is so overwhelming. You basically cannot move outside of the socially liberal, really radically progressive orthodoxy. And if you do, you are basically shut down, or, everything becomes harder than it otherwise ought to be, as we've seen in cases like, Roland Fryer, for example, Michael Lacour in the US. These are people who in different ways, the grievance hoax scandal, in different ways have shown just how truly absurd legacy universities, the status quo, have become, because they've either produced findings that have challenged the radical progressive orthodoxy and then they've been shut down, or they've leaned into that by cheating and presiding over hoaxes that have revealed how absolutely ridiculous the current establishment has become. So the centre that Eric has set up at Buckingham, I think, is a symbol of this pushback. And in that case, to look at social science, to ask questions that should be asked in legacy institutions but aren't being asked. For example, okay, we know that for every one conservative academic in the universities today, you basically have about 10 to 12 left-wing academics. So the end result is we have an enormous literature on the far right, right populism. I used to work in that literature, but we have almost no similar understanding of wokeism, radical leftism, contemporary communism. I was struck reading a handbook recently by a scholar called Pedro Sacchetti, and it's a handbook on left-wing extremism. And this was maybe 3 years ago. And it opens by saying, remarkably, this is one of the only handbooks on left-wing extremism in the social sciences. And, you look at the enormous literature on the populist right. Every PhD student almost in social sciences working on the populist right. And you just think, wow, this is completely imbalanced. So the centre is also going to be not only looking at things like, what is woke ideology? Where did it come from? How is it changing our society? But also things like, what is the role of family breakdown in crime and social breakdown? What is the link between mental health and support for wokeism and LGBTQ and all the rest of it? So we're going to be looking at things that are considered to be taboo, to use the title of Eric's great book on woke ideology. And we're just going to be looking at them in a very direct, straightforward, open way, which is exactly what higher education should be doing. And whether it's at Buckingham, whether it's at the Peterson Academy, whether it's at the University of Texas, Austin, whether it's at Ralston College, wherever it is, there is now an ecosystem online that is very active and actually, I think, very compelling to students as well, who can see what's going on. And just my last comment, I used to teach at Kent a third-year module on European politics. And 2 or 3 weeks into that module every year, students would approach me and say the same thing, because it would take them 1 or 2 weeks to sort of build up the confidence to kind of, who is this guy, this controversial figure on campus? And they would come up, they would always say the same thing. I'm so glad I'm finally getting to take this module, because until now I felt as though I was being indoctrinated by left-wing scholars. And those are students. So I don't buy into the snowflake generation narrative. I think students are fully aware of how corrupt and ideologically captured universities have become. I think they are fully aware of how broken the system is. They are just gaming it. They're staying quiet, going along with it, because the Conservatives know they better not say anything, because that will violate, their marks, that will put them at a disadvantage. And it's a profoundly depressing realization that we're all just participating in this Ponzi scheme, and even the students are now fully aware of it. So that's the only thing that I took a bit of comfort from. So, okay.
I'm with you on that. That's my assessment of the students coming through Cambridge as well. And it's what an extraordinary irony that it's those institutions that are not receiving a penny from the public purse that are modelling how institutions of higher learning should be fulfilling their obligations to the public square. University of Buckingham, of course, I think is pretty much the only privately funded university in the country. If you look across at America, it's places like Hillsdale, University of Austin, much newer, of course, at Ralston, that are they're not taking any federal funding, and therefore not under the lot of legislation that is sort of driving the conformity. But it's just a striking irony and paradox and that just takes us nicely onto this sort of second area where I think you've played such a sort of key role in shaking things up, and that is how to describe it. It's new media. It's this emerging ecosystem of YouTubers, podcasts, Substack essays. Your own Substack, which I read regularly. I'm just think that, just one, 2 or 3 essays a week strikes me that, I learn an awful lot of political science from your work. And it's probably the case that I'd have thought, the number of people reading just one of your essays probably exceeds the total number of students that would have ever passed through your lecture halls in an entire career at Kent. And so there's this pedagogical power to the new media, precisely because of the greater scope that it's got, long-form conversations that you couldn't find on the BBC or on ITV, long essays that would be capped by a word count and a sort of an assiduous editor in one of the broadsheets. So say more about how you came to understand, because you're one of the first out of the gates, how you came to understand the power of these new tools to do what effectively a lot of the higher ed universities, higher ed educations were just signally failing to do.
Well, I think for me, Substack's been a complete game changer. I mean, it changed my life, basically. And I think there are 2 things that are very important about it. I was always struck by the finding that 85% of academic articles are never read outside of the people who have written them and reviewed them. At the same time, the universities were telling academics for much of the last 20 years, you've got to have impact. You've got to impact the world around you. And I was looking and I think, well, not many people here are actually having a lot of impact. And I wanted to be in the public debate because I felt that that is really where the battle of ideas is taking place. And Substack as a platform basically puts you in the fast lane, gives you the ability to do that. We have close to, we're about 80,000 daily readers. We have close to 2 million unique visitors every month. We have people in 181 countries, which basically makes us a magazine, essentially. And I say that not to boast, but to say the impact and the reach, therefore, is enormous compared to what I was doing in the universities. But the second thing is it also makes you fully insulated, in the sense that unless I say something completely and utterly outrageous, I'm not getting cancelled. I'm not getting shut down. I'm not looking over my shoulder. I can say what I want, when I want, to people who have a very good understanding about what I believe, what I think, and where I'm trying to go. Now, let's just be real for a moment. There are disadvantages with that model too, because you have to write regularly. Sometimes the pieces that you put out might not always be as strong as some of your colleagues might like. They might not always be as anchored in. They're not peer reviewed. There are downsides to this model, but I've become convinced of the power of it. I mean, for example, we were the first platform, the first publication saying on the rape gangs, the grooming gang scandal in the UK, that we should be deporting dual nationals, people with dual nationality. We should be deporting them out of the UK, and we should be using visa programs and penalties to force countries like Pakistan to take them back. That piece got a lot of readership, was picked up by a number of politicians, found its way into the Reform Manifesto and became policy, and I suspect at some point will become policy in this country. We also launched a campaign for data and transparency in government and the state, saying you cannot accuse citizens of misinformation, which Keir Starmer has continuously done, while hiding information and data from tax-paying citizens about how things like mass immigration are changing their country. Because the state does not release data on welfare, tax payments, criminality by nationality and immigration status. We have a data vacuum. So on the one hand, we're told we should trust the expert class and we should believe in these big policies like mass migration. But on the other hand, we're not given the information and the data to make up our own minds to assess that. So we launched a campaign for data and transparency. Now the Labour government in 2025 is beginning to move on that, releasing data on, for example, illegal migrants awaiting deportation, criminality, and what crimes they've committed. They've confirmed that they're going to start to move to deport sex offenders and criminals, foreign criminals, based on data that we've been asking for. So, I'm very aware of the criticism of the model, and I'm very aware of the criticism of me personally that some of my colleagues would say, well, you're selling out, you've gone public. My response to them would be, I've probably achieved more impact on this platform in 2 years than the vast majority of academics have ever achieved in their entire careers, right? And that's the power of it. As long as you're staying true to evidence and you're being authentic and you're being very open with people, we have a lot of evidence in our stack. We have a lot of polling. We have a lot of surveys. We have a lot of articles that people won't normally read or hear about on the BBC because they're, the reports that are challenging the consensus are swept under the carpet. And we bring those to light. And I think it's that notion of voice, that notion of actually we're speaking up for people who do not have a voice in this conversation.
And the fact is that even if you're an academic in the ivory tower who is exercised by these issues, has got the research to inform the public on these debates, the nature of academic publishing is such that it moves at such a glacial pace. Even the best journals, you're not actually able to get any content out there, any research out there that is even remotely responsive to the speed at which these issues develop now in British politics, indeed in world politics. And
it's controlled by gatekeepers. Let's just be frank. I mean, even if you did want to do responsive research, you have to also get it through a peer review process, which I would argue is ideologically captured. So, you have to play a game at multiple levels to get something through the system.
Absolutely right. So there's gatekeeping at the peer review process in the top tier journals, but there's also gatekeeping of the big pot of public funds for research more generally. I think the government has something like a £10 billion a year budget for higher ed. 8 billion of that goes towards research. And certainly I know in the arts and humanities, I suspect it's the same in the social sciences, the committees that effectively decide on how those funds are allocated, effectively, it's really other academics, will almost always be ideologically compromised, in my view. And perhaps that won't be deliberate. It'll simply reflect the existing asymmetries in political preference across the academy.
One example of that, you cannot apply in the UK for a major research grant unless you submit something called a diversity statement. That is a document, an A4 document, that requires you to publicly swear allegiance to the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. How will this research contribute to what is an openly political goal of DEI? Now, if it was up to me, all of that would be stripped out of research funding. In fact, I'd probably go further and say that taxpayer-funded research that specifically advocates political activism, I don't think should be funded, is my view. Now, all of that needs to be stripped out, like the Americans are doing. Diversity statements when people are going for jobs, when they're going for research grants. Now, none of that happens. I'm my own boss with Substack. Like, I'm fully insulated. I can say what I want, when I want. I don't have to do that. And I think this is where the universities, and they haven't quite realized this, they're not just alienating contrarians, losing conservatives, gender critical scholars, and so on, but they're losing the public. If you look at every major survey across the West, public trust in universities is collapsing. Confidence and trust in Ivy League colleges, UK universities is collapsing. So they are undermining themselves. Unless they reform, unless they start to get back to neutrality, science, truth, reason, good faith debate, they're going to continue to lose the public.
Well, we talking about the general public. I mean, of course, your Substack essays and all of that work, that's directed again. If you've got a big base of subscribers, 75,000 and counting from all over the world, but they will generally, I suppose, be within sort of the elites and intellectual elites, or very reflective professionals wanting to keep abreast of what's going on. But there's another dimension to your work in the media, which is trying to reach the general public, who's either not terribly interested in the intricacies of big policy debates or the finer points of political science, but feels that it's being starved of the truth and of political balance. So tell us a bit about your work as a broadcast journalist. Relatively recent, I think. Of course, you've been popping up on the BBC and ITV channel for years, but you've now got a platform, GB News. Tell us, first of all, a bit about GB News for those who are not Brits, so people who are not so aware of it, and its sort of disruptive effects on the British British broadcast media landscape, and also your own role within it and how you see that complementing your work, both as an academic and on Substack as a sort of digital journalist.
Well, GB News is a disruptor in the sense that Substack is a disruptor and new universities are disruptors. I view GB News as part of a wider ecosystem that is about correcting the system, giving voice to the forgotten majority on issues that the ruling class would rather people not know about and not talk about. That's my basic view of GB News. Now, of course, the elite class hate GB News because it is everything that they despise. It also represents people who, to be frank, they despise. And that's why I wanted to support it, because I think it's really important. And it's getting very good figures relative to the BBC and Sky. So I just want to go back to one thing you said, though, which was many of the people reading you are probably elite. I actually think it's the opposite, because I think on all of these big salient issues today, what we call culture war issues, even though I never use that term myself, because nationhood, defending our history, women's rights, these are not culture wars, these are foundational to who we are. A lot of those issues don't break 50-50. A lot of those issues in the public opinion world will break 80-20. Right, with the 20% liberal, progressive, who dominate the institutions, having the national conversation built around them. We have endless numbers of podcasts and television channels and books and programs and you name it for the 15 to 20% liberal, progressive, elite minority. But on issues like migration, borders, rape gangs, economy, culture, we have very little for the 75 to 80%. So I took a very conscious decision to have a conversation with the 75 to 80% about what is going on in their country. So what are they not being told about what is happening? And can we do that in a responsible way that is anchored in evidence? Sure, at times it's very combative and it's very direct, but that's the means of communication. But can we speak as loudly for them and to them as the institutions speak for the liberal progressive minority? Now, when I used to go on the BBC and the Guardian and do all that stuff, and I still do, the conversations are managed. If you and I were having this conversation on BBC Radio 4 Today, as an example, which I went on regularly and still do on occasion, you would ask me a question, and the moment I start speaking, you would be managing my response to that. Okay, let's keep it short. You'll be doing things like that. I can go on GB News. We can have a free-flowing conversation for an hour and a half about pretty much anything people want to talk about. You're not going to be cut. You're not going to be edited. It's not going to be managed. You're not going to have to lean into the 15 to 20% values. You're going to be able to say what you want, and we're going to have a conversation about the country. And that is what people are looking for. That is why long-form podcasts have blown up. That is why this new media ecosystem have blown up, because people can see when they're watching the flagship shows, when they're watching Question Time, when they're watching BBC Radio 4 Today, when big shows in the UK, when they're watching those, they can see that the conversation is being managed. The supply of information is being managed. And that is what we're in. I mean, I do genuinely believe with NS Lions and people like that, we are in a censorship industrial complex that is using legacy media aligned with hate laws, non-crime hate incidents, taboos, concept creep, to basically try and control the national conversation. And what I'm trying to do in my work is push back against that and get back to the idea of truth. What is really happening in this country and in the West more generally? What is the evidence actually saying about the effects of these elite policies that nobody in the elite actually seems to have to live with the consequences of those policies, but everybody else does? What is the evidence actually saying about that? And can we be countercultural in presenting that and offering a different perspective that people just aren't going to get on shows like the BBC. Just one brief example. I went on Question Time recently. This is the number one political show in the UK. And I don't think anybody will mind me saying this, but in the aftermath of that show, having talked about immigration, having talked about borders, having talked about the war in Ukraine, the need to bring peace to Ukraine, to have a peace deal, the need to control our borders, the need to lower mass migration. In the green room afterwards, somebody quite senior in the BBC said, I think it's really important we have your perspective. I think it's really crucial we have your perspective on this show. Show watched by millions of people.
As if it's some radical set of ideas that only a tiny proportion of people might sign up to.
And I just stood there thinking, everything I've just said on this show is basically, with the exception of the issue of Ukraine, which is more polarized, everything I've said, reduce, end mass uncontrolled immigration, control the borders, have a national statutory inquiry on the rape gangs, the most horrific scandal in British history. Do more for regions outside of London. Give ordinary tax-paying, hard-working, law-abiding people a voice in a national conversation. These are 75-80% positions. This is what everybody out there is thinking and feeling. Now, my advantage is my background is not from the elite institutions. It's not from that world. And so I'm always struck at just how adrift the people in power really have become. And I think Sullivan was right. I think they've radicalized to such an extent, partly in reaction to things like Brexit and Trump and the rise of national conservatism, that I think they've moved so far to the cultural left. They now don't quite understand how far away from the average voter they really are. And it's been quite remarkable.
Mm. And this takes us nicely and neatly on to the question of what can be done about this and what political tools are available to a movement, to a prospective government to deal with this issue. We've seen across the Atlantic the emergence of the MAGA movement, this sort of extraordinary kind of pressure valve, a sort of cri de coeur from the American people, the sort of the left behind in America to try and fix the media landscape, the sort of sense-making institutions. I mean, what realistically could a government that cares about these issues, cares about rebalancing things and modelling a diversity of opinion to the general public, what could be done? I mean, for example, take the BBC. You're prime minister for a day. Would you cancel the license fee? Would you sever public funding and just say, look, the Reithian vision is over, and it's just every company for itself?
Mm. Well, it's a big question. The first thing I just wanted to say is I took a decision a couple of years ago. I didn't think intellectually I could remain in the universities teaching as a full-time academic and be as active as I have become in the public realm. I just think they're incompatible. We have to make a choice. And I don't think, even though many of my colleagues on the left have never made that choice, I wanted to publicly break with my formal academic role and say, okay, if I'm going to do this, I can't continue to do that. So I say that just to get across the point that I genuinely believe we are losing our country and we are losing the things that define the greater civilization we have created. And the end of that, the end of those things is much closer than we currently even now realize. I said on social media that I think we probably have 2 general elections to fundamentally turn the tide in the UK. And Elon Musk responded and said he thinks we have 1. I think by the end of the 2030s, things will be in place that will become irreversible. And I feel that we are at a civilizational moment and we have to force change across the board, which is why I've become quite public at campaigning against what I would call the Unit Party, an indistinguishable project in Westminster that has given us, through the left and the right, mass migration, broken borders, a London-centric economy, politically compromised institutions, and a rejection of our cultural inheritance in different forms. Both the Tories and Labour have enabled that. So my view now is, and has been for a while, that we need to smash that consensus. What does that change look like? What does it mean? I think a lot of the things I've just referenced are second-order problems. Mass migration, broken borders, woke ideology. Those are second-order problems. The primary problem is the ruling class in this country and the people who dominate our institutions. So the first point of change has to be to replace the people who dominate the state bureaucracy and the institutions, and to bring a counter elite forward that is much more in touch with the people. I think that is the primary task, the main thing that has to happen. What then has to happen is we need a factory reset in this country. And by that, I mean return to the pre-Blairite era, where our entire legislative framework was not built around the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act. We should also, PS, leave the European Convention on Human Rights, and we should return to where we were before the Blairite revolution. Now, for viewers and listeners outside of the UK, what I'm saying is we should reject what we've inherited from the Labour governments from the uniparty governments between 1997 and today, the core legislative backbone of that, and return. So that's why I'm calling it the factory reset. That's what we need, because I think if we don't have that, we can see exactly where we're heading in this country. We have sectarianism in our politics and society. We have collapsing levels of public trust in the system, mainly because of mass migration and broken borders. We have apathy and disillusionment. We have a sort of sense of impending crisis, because that's exactly what we have. And we have endless demoralization among our people. And so this is, I don't even think it is about reforming the system. I actually think it is almost about a people's revolution against the system. I actually think the word reform doesn't quite capture it. It is a political revolution in the same way that Blair led a political revolution in this country. And a counter-revolution has to begin with rejecting much of what those governments actually brought about.
You've set out brilliantly the key ingredients that would be needed for that. You've got purpose, personnel, and policy, you could say. The purpose is you've got 2 electoral cycles to save the nation. And I think, just judging by the existential angst in the country, and we're seeing this in the polls, I think, particularly in the support for reform, I think there is a sort of an emerging consensus there. But I think the headaches are, when you talk about personnel and policy, you're talking about personnel, where is this counter-elite going to come from? Given that, as we've already discussed, a lot of the stables for the elite are really where a lot of these problems began. And third, when it comes onto policy, how does one undertake that kind of political rewiring of the British state when, as we know, there are just so many forces leveled against that happening, and the Blairite sort of rewiring was so effective and entrenched. It's going to take enormous political skill and will to overturn that. So on the personnel question first.
Sure. I always remember the infamous line by Chris Lash that the next big revolt will not be the people rising up against the elite, but the elite rising up against the people. And that's basically what we had between 2000 and 2016, was a top-down elite project that alienated the people. But now what is happening across the West is a reassertion of the people against the elite. And what we're seeing is popular sovereignty being used to correct the system. I mean, that's what happened in 2019. Boris Johnson later betrayed and lied to the British people. But what happened in 2019 was a reassertion of popular sovereignty to get Brexit over the line. Now, that battle is in the past. On all of the big issues that are now shaping the future of my country, England, Britain, popular sovereignty, I genuinely believe the people will force through the change that will save their country. If you take mass immigration as an example, in 2025, the Brits have never been as negative and skeptical about that project as they are today. Only about 1 in 5 people think immigration has been good for Britain. Okay, because people are now beginning to realize the legacy of Johnson and the Tories. 90% of migration into this country is coming from outside of Europe. It's making us poorer, it's driving up crime. So give power to the people, unleash that power, and correct the system. In terms of the counter elite, perfectly good point. I think, my personal view, Trump too has provided, whatever you think about what he's doing in office, the mechanisms of getting to Trump 2 provide a proof of concept, which is before any new government takes place in 2029, 2034, every counter proposal has to have been designed and thought through. So what does the Great Repeal Act look like that basically rejects much of the Blairite inheritance? What does that legislation look like? What is the plan for exiting the ECHR, which I think is the only thing that can ensure we can deport foreign criminals, reclaim full judicial sovereignty, control our borders, be more accountable to the people. What is the exact plan mechanism for doing that? Who can do that, you say? Well, I can think already, I'm not going to name them on this show, I could think of a dozen people, good people who have already thought through those issues, who could be part of what we might call a coalition of the willing. They might be conservatives, they might be apolitical. But if you said to me, well, Matt, how would you regain control over migration? One of the first things we could do is we could end indefinite leave to remain, which is the policy whereby if you've lived in this country for 5 years, you can stay forever. Well, Kemi Badenoch and the Tories have said, let's extend that to 10. Let's scrap it. Let's scrap non-crime hate incidents. In fact, let's scrap hate laws. We've got laws against racism and prejudice from the 1980s. We don't need this Orwellian layer on top. There's a whole bunch of things that we could do. The proposals are already out there that we could bring in to a serious manifesto for change. The question is, who is the person who is going to bring all of that together? I mean, there are ideas. We know the people who are out there who have ideas for rewiring the state, rewiring the bureaucracy, removing the kind of blob class, the quangocracy, the rise of this sort of unelected, unaccountable, amorphous state blob needs to be dramatically reduced and gutted. Educational reforms. I know lots of people who have very good ideas for protecting schools from political indoctrination, removing third parties that are preaching critical race theory or gender ideology in our schools, returning to meritocracy, stripping out identity politics from public sector institutions. All of that is needed, but you got to have somebody who can bring it together. And you've got to have somebody who can delegate.
I think you're right. You look back to the Thatcher Revolution in the late 70s. You look back to the Blair Revolution in the 90s. The fact is, it was a relatively small number of people around Thatcher and Blair who came up with that vision and implemented it with big wins at the general elections in 79 and 97, respectively. But there is a sense now, and you've been tracking this very well in your commentary, that really for the first time in 100 years, the grip of the two-party duopoly of Labour and Conservative is just not fit for purpose. There just there aren't even a dozen people in either of those parties that could take charge of either party and deliver that kind of sort of revolutionary program that Thatcher and Blair incubated. And so we've seen, of course, the rise of Reform UK, which is really the first time we have seen a party on the British political right that is not the Conservative Party, really since political parties began, the first time since really the 17th century. And now you've been watching their rise, you've been documenting it, you're close, as I understand it, to a lot of people within Reform. Do you think they have, bluntly, what it takes in terms of the personnel and the policy to bring about the revolution that you think the country needs?
I think Reform are launching the biggest assault on this two-party system that we've seen since the rise of the Social Democratic Party in the 1980s. And in many ways, it's going to be a much bigger assault on the two-party system than anything we've seen since the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century. And I think, everything is there for reform. The issues are there. The public concern over those issues is there. The demographic coherency in their electorate is there. The geography is there. They could sweep down the East Coast into the Red Wall, into Wales, into the Tory shires. Everything is there that a movement like Reform would need to launch a full-scale national revolt, which is exactly what Nigel Farage said he was going to do when he came back in 2024. He wanted to lead a people's revolt. We also know public demand isn't enough. You have to supply that demand with a credible, competent, coherent alternative. And if you look at the literature on political science, you get two phases. You get the breakthrough phase. That's what we're witnessing now. Reform in 2025, Reform is 3 years old. It's already averaging, as we're speaking now in the spring of 2025, it's already averaging in the mid-20s in the national polls, which is an incredible achievement. It's in the breakthrough period, but we know what comes next is the consolidation period. Can you build the local foundations? Can you build the shadow cabinet? Can you build the 2-3 year lead in, like the Heritage Foundation in America? Can you have the policy work done before government even begins, right? Can you get all of that done? Now, I don't think it's a secret to say Reform is not yet at that point of having everything figured out. But I do think if they lean into it, they've got the biggest opportunity to do that than anybody has had since the Labour Party in the early 20th century. And I really hope they do what they need to do to fill that space, opening up to a team of people, a coalition of people, accepting that there are people from across the political landscape who have fully developed thoughts and ideas about how to actually reform the system. And they might not always be reformers. They might be at Cambridge or Oxford. They might have spent their life looking at the intricacies of regaining judicial sovereignty, reforming the migration tribunal system, whatever, bringing those people in, showing enough humility that is required to bring those people in. That is going to be the key as to whether reform really maximizes that. Because the last thing I'd say is look across Western democracies. I've said this for 10 years. What we are living through is a full-scale political realignment, whereby the established parties that dominated the 20th century, largely because of the left-right axis being around economics, have struggled to transition to the second era of mass democracy, where politics has not just become one-dimensional, but two-dimensional, with these cultural issues becoming as important to voters as economics. Now, a lot of the established parties have simply been unable to respond to that because they were built for another time, which is why we've seen Giorgia Meloni, why we've seen Donald Trump, why we've seen the Sweden Democrats, Austrian Freedom Party, Geert Wilders and the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, among many others. It's taken different forms in different parties. The assumption in Britain was that, well, because of our civic culture and our two-party system, the Labour-Tory dominance would manage to see that off. I think in 2025, the evidence for that is very shaky. In fact, at the 2024 general election, you had the lowest combined share of the vote for the two main parties for decades. Labour might have a big majority, but it came in on the lowest share of the vote for an incoming majority government, again, for decades. Apathy is the real winner right now. None of the above politics is dominant. If you can tap into that and turn it into an instrumental endorsement of an alternative, everything is for the taking. Everything is wide open.
One of the challenges the European parties, populist parties that you mentioned earlier, faced was the problem that although there was clearly an enormous popular realignment, that wasn't tracked by any kind of elite realignment or establishment realignment.
Absolutely.
And I can't remember which of those so-called Italian elite theorists was it who said, coined the iron law of oligarchy. The idea that, for real change to happen in the end, whether you like it or not, and this is something populists just have to face up to, it's going to be an elite that brings about political change.
Yeah.
And right now, the establishment has worked very effectively to ensure that reform is somehow low status. It's something unseemly about joining it. Much better to be a good kind of grandee patrician Tory and go down with the ship in 2029 and even contemplate, going out campaigning with this, with this disruptor. And there's something, and I think within Britain, that's something that really matters. We're always still kind of acutely aware of sort of social distinctions of class and so on and so forth. And there's this sort of big, to move from the sort of breakthrough phase to the implementation phase is going to require a kind of breaking of the dam, as it were, and important kind of polished, high status people being willing to come through and help out as part of this coalition.
I think that's true, but I think, to be frank, I think it's going to happen anyway. I think status conscious Tories have a lot to answer for. I think they have sold this country down the river. I think they've consistently put their own interests ahead of the national interest. And personally, I could not look myself in the mirror and be a member of the Conservative Party, given what it has done to this country. That's my personal view. So I've never been one for status politics. I because of reasons in my background and so on, I didn't pass through the system that I think is a system that has shaped many people in Westminster. My start and end point is, how do we save the country? I have no real time for public perception of, is this a high status thing, low status thing? I'm just, my ground zero is what's best for this country. And a lot of those people don't yet understand we are witnessing the death of the Conservative Party. We are really witnessing the end of one of the most successful political parties in the history of liberal democracy. There is no evidence, as you and I talk in 2025, of any serious recovery. The brand is toxic. The red wall, among many other areas, will simply never go back to the Conservatives because of the sense of betrayal after 2019. And the Conservative Parliamentary Party is clinging to a set of values that have been repudiated, not just in the UK, but across much of the West. So the party's over. The question is, who is going to understand what is unfolding and is willing to play a role in what is going to come next. And I do think there are a handful of good Conservative politicians who understand the magnitude of what's about to unfold in this country, and they're going to want to play a role in helping to turn it around. And those people could be useful, but there are going to be a lot of others who are going to, rearrange the chairs on the Titanic and go down with the Tories. I mean, it's averaging 21%. It's like game over. And the argument at the next general election is not going to be vote Reform, get Labour. It's going to be, vote Tory, get Labour. And just fast forward to 28, 29. If this momentum continues behind Reform, potentially a party that will be winning by-elections, winning in Wales, doing better in Scotland than any other party Nigel Farage has had in the past, will be very competitive across non-London England. I mean, the issues that are driving it are going to become bigger and bigger. There's no serious response to the small boat crisis. There's no serious response to fixing our borders. There's no serious response to ending mass uncontrolled immigration. There's no serious response to preserving free speech and individual liberty. There's no serious plan for growth. Taxes are the highest since 1940s. Debt is out of control. Net zero's become a religion for the ruling class. What's going to get better in this country over the next 5 years? it's just going to get worse. What we're living in is managed decline because nobody has the big answers to shake up the system. I do actually think, personally, reform has some really interesting stuff that would make an immediate difference, particularly around the economy, particularly around net zero, particularly around migration. So when people say, well, does reform have the answers? They've got a lot of things that actually are not being pushed within the uniparty consensus that I think should be implemented.
And is there a name for that? I mean, one of the criticisms that is sometimes leveled at reform is that, it's got very good instincts on all of the issues that you've just listed. And it looks as if it's more serious about addressing those issues than the duopoly, than the uniparty. But what is its organizing vision? Does it need one? Is it the case that, look, we're just in a state of emergency, just let's leave political philosophy to the eggheads? Or does it need to start saying, look, this is Farageism? And if that's the case, what is Farageism? What is it? Is it conservatism? Is it national conservatism? What is it? Is it part of the sort of the phenomenon of the new right, which is sweeping across continental Europe and the United States? How would you, just stepping back a little bit, sort of jumping out of the trenches?
Yeah.
What is the sort of organizing philosophical framework for all of this? Or if you had to offer one, what would it be?
Well, the first thing is I wouldn't call it Farageism because I think the movement that is unfolding is bigger than one person and is going to last for a very long time. So I would not say, what is Farageism? I also wouldn't over-intellectualize it in the sense that conservatism, as Scruton and Oakeshott said, has always been more of an impulse than an ideological manifesto. My view is fundamentally, this is about taking our country back and giving people freedom from an overbearing state, an overbearing policy of demographic change and mass migration that they never voted for, preserving freedom from woke ideology, from imposition of radical non-scientific ideologies from above, and broadly delivering a project that is what we would call national conservatism, but I would not publicly call it that because I think the potential for this runs across the political landscape. It isn't just a Tory tribute act. It is, I think, a commitment to nation, sovereignty, individual liberty, reform, say, family, community, country as a shorthand for the allegiances and the loyalties that have been basically eroded over time. And that, to me, is enough at this stage before moving on and developing that into policy. Now, there are people out there, let's just have a candid conversation, who would say, well, it's thin and it's lightweight and there isn't an ism. But I'm skeptical, have always been skeptical of utopian isms because instinctively I am a conservative. So I don't want to sit here and say there is this map of an ideological project that is going to be implemented and it's going to be entirely coherent, because I think we are already at crisis point, and the first stage of this is to start implementing, a sort of getting this country off life support.
Hard to disagree with any of that. I think I would just maybe add that national conservatism as a sort of international movement is not national Toryism, and that it does have within it a kind of pragmatist streak and a willingness to adapt to certain circumstances. So, for example, if you're seeing across the Atlantic on economics, you're seeing the GOP leaning, further to the left on economics under Trump than we've seen in many, many decades. And I think
reform on nationalisation.
Right. And I think so. The idea is that, if the primary goal, the organising horizon, is to conserve the nation, then the solutions to that will look different at different junctures of the nation's development and in light of the different challenges that it's facing. Matt, final question. What, if anything, gives you hope in the future?
So I think the political changes that we're seeing, because we are in an era of volatility, which brings a lot of opportunity, and it shows that the people are restless and they're hungry for change, which is reassuring. The status quo is not going to last. Something else is about to come forward. We don't know what that is, but we might be able to shape it. The views of Zoomers and millennials, Zoomers especially, a sense that actually they want to play a part in that struggle has been reassuring. The rise of this ecosystem that we've talked about, the fact that you can go on YouTube, podcasts, Substacks, new television channels, new universities, new courses, and you can actively disassociate yourself from the prevailing culture, I think is really, really important. There were moments in time where you just simply couldn't do that. I think what's happening in North America is incredibly important. I think that is establishing a zeitgeist that will have ripple effects. In some ways bad, as we've seen in some countries as a backlash to that. But I think over the long haul, the proof of concept that will be delivered, particularly for the UK, is really important, because come 2028, 29, it will not be possible to say, you aren't seriously suggesting we root out woke ideology from public institutions. How would you even do that? Say, well, look what the Americans have just done. You aren't seriously suggesting we take control of the borders and leave the ECHR, and how can we ever possibly break with the status quo? Look at what America's just done. So I think the proof of concept will be really important. That gives me cause for optimism as well. So I'm more optimistic than I have been actually for a long time. And I think just lastly, however cautious I am about social media, and I'm guilty of this myself, social media is an incredibly polarizing environment. And there have definitely been times where I've leaned into that, but I viewed it as necessary for the particular battle at the time. But I think the opening up of social media, Facebook, X, has been incredibly important. Elon Musk has been incredibly important. Whatever you think of his other views and activities and so on, the opening up of social media to allow conservatives and gender critical people to get back into the room and have a debate and force a debate. And then we've seen the cascade effects through things like, the Supreme Court judgment in the UK, or the Cass review, or highlighting two-tier policing and the rape gang scandal and the lack of information on issues that citizens should have. I think all of that has been enormous. It wasn't that long ago. Social media was locked down, and people like me and others were basically not able to even enter the public square and have a debate. Where we are now, I actually think, yes, it comes with downsides, but it's a healthier place to be, because it is about free speech, free expression, the exchange of ideas, and all of those things that I think, unfortunately, we've lost in the universities.
Matt Goodwin, thanks for joining First Light.
Thank you for having me.